Hello, friends, and let's get started.
David sat on the couch in the living room, staring at the television screen, but the plot of the movie escaped his attention. His thoughts were centered on his wife, Amanda. She was late. Again. He glanced at the clock. It was almost 9 o'clock at night. Amanda should have been back from work an hour ago. She'd warned him she'd be late, but it had been happening too often lately. Picking up his cell phone, he dialed her number. One ring tone a second. On the third ring, Amanda finally answered. "Hi, David." Her voice sounded a little tired, but cheerful. "I'm still at work. We're almost done with the presentation for a new client. I think I'll be home in an hour." "Good, are you okay?" He replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Yeah, I'm fine, just a lot to do." "David, did you have dinner?" she asked with concern in her voice. "Yeah, don't worry about it." She said a quick goodbye, and the connection was cut off. David looked at the phone, as if trying to find something in her voice that could confirm his growing sense of unease. This wasn't like Amanda. She'd never been late without a good reason before. Her schedule had always been clear, almost predictable. And now, it was like she was becoming a stranger. It was almost 11 when Amanda got home. She entered quietly, as if trying not to attract attention, but David was already waiting for her in the kitchen. His gaze lingered on her face, her makeup a little smudged, her hair a mess. Perhaps she was tired, but something about her appearance seemed unnatural. "You're late," he said, tearing his gaze away from the mug of unfinished coffee. "Yeah, I'm sorry. This client is so picky. My team and I reworked the presentation almost 10 times." She smiled, but it looked strained. "You probably weren't expecting me, were you?" "No," David lied, watching her take off her coat and hang it on the hook. Amanda walked over, gave him a quick peck on the cheek, and headed for the bedroom. The kiss was perfunctory, mechanical, like a gesture to be performed for the sake of propriety. David stayed in the kitchen, feeling a chill run down his spine. A week passed, and the feeling of unease only increased. Amanda was late to work again, and these delays were becoming more and more regular. One evening, sitting on the couch, David noticed her hastily hiding her phone as he entered the room. He stopped on the threshold. "Who was that?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "No one. Just a colleague." Her answer was quick, almost reflexive. She didn't even look at him, continuing to scroll through the screen. "Colleague?" he interjected, stepping closer. "I thought you said you didn't have anything urgent to do. Just finalizing the details of the project. You know we're always in a rush before the deadline." David nodded silently, but something inside him clenched. He noticed Amanda tucking her phone in her bag, not leaving it on the desk as usual. Her gestures were hurried, almost nervous. He could feel a wave of suspicion slowly rising behind him. Over the weekend, David had suggested going on a picnic in the park, as they had often done before. He knew they needed to spend more time together. Amanda agreed, but all day she seemed distracted, checking her phone often and barely smiling. When they got home, David decided to talk to her. "Amanda, are you okay? It's like you haven't been with me for the past few weeks." She looked up but didn't answer right away. Then she sighed tiredly. "It's just work. You have no idea how stressed I am right now. New client, new challenges. Sometimes I feel like I'm drowning in it all." "I'm sorry, honey." Her explanation sounded plausible, but David couldn't escape the thought that it wasn't the whole truth. Her behavior was too strange, her distance too obvious. The next afternoon, David deployed the vacuum hose from the vacuum cleaner in a familiar motion while dragging the chair over to the window. Cleaning on Saturdays had become a way for him to distract himself from troubling thoughts. Amanda said she was off to the store, although her shopping trips lately had been taking longer than usual. David was carefully vacuuming the corners when his gaze fell on her cell phone, left on the kitchen counter. It was a rare occasion. She usually kept it to herself. He continued cleaning, but his gaze returned to the phone again and again. The small device lay there, promising to reveal answers to questions he was afraid to ask. There was a struggle going on inside him. David had always prided himself on their trust. They had agreed not to intrude on each other's personal space. But something inside said he had to look, and when the phone vibrated, the screen lit up. One message. David took a step closer to see the sender's name, Gregory. The name seemed familiar. Yes, it was her boss, the one she'd mentioned several times before. "He's so demanding." Says only perfection is worthy of a client. Those were the words Amanda had uttered last week when explaining another late return. But why was he texting her on a Saturday? David slowly wiped his hands on his towel and gingerly picked up his phone. The screen was still active, and the text of the message flashed in the background. Can't wait for Monday. You weren't holding back yesterday, like always. David's heart raced. His hands trembled a little. It could have been a misunderstanding, but his gut told him otherwise. He realized he was violating trust, but the sudden need to know the truth outweighed all reasoning. His finger trembled slightly as he swiped across the screen to open the messages. The chat between Amanda and Gregory was shorter than he'd expected, but each line was like a punch to his chest. You always know how to make me feel good. Don't forget, you deserve better. You looked amazing in that Lacy lingerie. You looked amazing at dinner last night. At dinner? David remembered Amanda saying she'd been in the office late doing a presentation, but a photo attached to one of the messages quickly dispelled his doubts. It was taken at an expensive restaurant. Amanda, in the very dress she wore for office work. She was smiling, but that smile was not for him. Across from her sat a man, presumably Gregory, with a confident, slightly cocky smile, as if he owned this moment. David closed his eyes, feeling his heart clench. He inhaled deeply, trying to stem the sudden rush of anger. It was like a hammer blow, quick and painful, leaving cracks in his confidence. He flicked upward, reading the messages. Each one revealed not only the flirting, but the realization that his wife was cheating on him with his boss. Don't let him make you feel guilty. Soon I can be around for as long as you want. Those lines tore him apart. David put the phone back on the counter like it was a red-hot object. His hands were shaking, and he sat down in the nearest chair. He needed time to gather his thoughts. He wanted to call her, to demand an explanation, but her phone was at home. Suddenly the realization came to him that such a conversation could not be had rashly. He walked around the house, trying to quiet his chaotic thoughts. Every corner of the room reminded him of her presence. The photos from their trips together, her favorite pillow on the couch, the book she'd read and left on the shelf. It all suddenly felt foreign. When the front door opened, David turned around. Amanda walked in, a smile on her face as if nothing had happened. In her hands were bags of groceries. David, I bought everything for your favorite dinner, she said enthusiastically, placing the bags on the kitchen table. David watched her as if she were a stranger. His gaze lingered on her face, studying every detail. It was the same Amanda he'd known for years, but at that moment, she seemed completely different to him. You look tired, she remarked as she stepped closer. Is everything all right? He couldn't answer right away. Instead, he just nodded, trying to hold back the storm of emotion. She smiled and went to sort through the groceries, humming something to herself. For 3 days, he walked around the house, as if on the edge of a precipice. Every word Amanda said, every gesture she made, every smile she smiled, seemed like a lie. He caught himself listening to her speak, but he couldn't hear her. The voice in his head kept saying one thing. She betrayed you. David couldn't stay silent any longer. That evening he sat on the edge of his bed, staring out the dark bedroom window. Amanda was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner. He knew he couldn't delay the conversation. The secrets he now carried inside him were weighing heavily on his chest. David took a deep breath and headed downstairs. Amanda stood at the sink washing dishes. Her back seemed too straight. She always hummed relaxedly while doing chores, but now there was silence. Perhaps she was feeling something too. We need to talk, he said as he entered the kitchen. She turned around. Her face seemed surprised, but perhaps a little too feigned. About what? She asked, wiping her hands with a towel. About us. And about what happens when you're not home, David said, his voice steady but restrained. Her smile disappeared. Amanda tensed slightly, but still kept her composure. Can you explain to me why your boss Gregory is texting you like this? He continued, looking her straight in the eye. Her face paled for a second, but she quickly regained her composure. Did you take my phone? Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but there was a defensive note in it. Yes, I did, David answered, not averting his gaze. Because after these messages, I can't trust your word anymore. Amanda looked away, as if she were going to collect her thoughts. She took a few steps toward the table and leaned on it. "It's not what you think," she finally said. Her voice was soft, almost pleading. "Not what I think." He interjected, his voice sharper. "I've seen the picture, Amanda. I saw him texting you that you looked gorgeous in your Lacy lingerie. I saw you smile at him in a way you haven't smiled at me in a long time. Explain to me how that's not what I think." She covered her face with her hands, but almost immediately lowered them, as if she realized the gesture was giving her away. "Just felt lonely," she said quietly. "We don't talk much. I was bored, and Gregory, he just listened to me, supported me. It's not like what?" David interrupted, his voice harder. "It's not that you lied to me? It's not that you betrayed our marriage? I didn't mean for it to go that far. I just wanted to have fun," she said, her eyes glistening but no tears flowing. "It just started as a friendship. Nothing more." David sighed, trying to quiet the anger that was growing inside him. He didn't want to lose control, but her words only added fuel to the fire. "Friendship? Nothing more? You call secret messages, dinners at restaurants, flattery and compliments friendship? That's not friendship, Amanda. It's betrayal." Her face contorted in pain, but she didn't look away. "You don't understand how I felt," she said, her voice trembling. "I felt like a nobody. You don't notice me." And he made me feel wanted again. David stepped closer, his eyes drilling her with his gaze. "I don't notice you?" He spoke slowly, as if each word weighed a ton. "I'm here every night. I try to support us. I thought we were on the same team. And instead of talking to me, you went to your understanding boss?" She lowered her eyes, her shoulders slumped. This was a moment when she could have apologized, admitted her mistake. But instead, she raised her head again, her voice firmer. "You're not perfect either, David. You've become distant. You think just being here is enough, but it's not." Confused, David pulled back, not believing his ears. He felt his hands clench into fists, but he forced himself to remain calm. "You're confused?" He grinned bitterly. "Good. But let me dispel your confusion. I know you're having an affair with Gregory. I know my wife is cheating on me. And I'll tell you what, it ends today. You're going to call him and tell him it's over. Or our marriage is over." Amanda froze. Her eyes widened, as if she only now realized that he was serious. "You can't demand this of me." "I can and I will," David interrupted her. "You're going to make a choice. It's either him or me." She looked up at him, her face a mixture of hurt and anger. They stood in silence, the tension between them growing. Amanda finally gave in. She looked away, her shoulders slumped. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll stop this right now." But David didn't feel relieved. Her voice sounded as if the decision had been wrenched away by force. Amanda picked up the phone from the table, her hands shaking. She looked at David, whose figure was as if carved from stone. His face was hard, his gaze steely. He crossed his arms over his chest, standing at the edge of the desk like a judge awaiting execution. "Call," he said coldly. Amanda nodded, trying not to show how tense she was. Dialing the number, she put the phone to her ear. A tense silence hung in the room. A dial tone a second. On the third ring, Gregory answered. "Hello, beautiful." His voice was light, with a touch of smugness. "I didn't think you'd call me so late. Did you miss me, darling?" Amanda closed her eyes as if gathering her strength. "Gregory, we need to talk." Her voice shook, but she tried to sound confident. "Of course," he replied, not losing his nonchalant confidence. "About anything. What's wrong?" She glanced at David, who was looking at her without blinking. Amanda took a deep breath. "We can't go on any longer. It's over." There was silence on the other end of the wire. Gregory seemed to digest what he had heard before he spoke again. "What?" His voice changed, becoming colder. "Amanda, is this some kind of joke?" "No, Gregory, this is not a joke. I can't do this anymore. It's wrong and I have to stop." Her voice broke on the last word, but she quickly pulled herself together. A chuckle was heard from the other side of the line, but that laugh was devoid of mirth. "Wrong?" he said, and there was a sneer in his tone. "Is that what your perfect husband told you? The one who doesn't even know how to keep you? You think I'm going to let you go back to that brat, Amanda?" Amanda opened her eyes abruptly, her face pale. David, standing next to her, tensed as he heard the words coming from the speaker. He couldn't hear everything, but Gregory's tone was eloquent enough. "Gregory, please," she said pleadingly. "Don't make this any harder than it has to be." "No, Amanda," he interrupted her, his voice more insistent now. "You deserve better than this. You deserve me. Do you really want to go back to a life where you're invisible? Where you're just a piece of furniture for a man who doesn't even know how to make you happy?" "Enough!" she shrieked, her voice trembling. "I said it's over. Don't call me again." She ended the call with trembling hands and placed the phone on the table as if it had burned her. Her eyes were full of tears, but she tried to hold them back. David stepped closer, his voice low and strained. "What did he say?" he asked. Amanda shook her head, trying to avoid his gaze. "It doesn't matter. I did what you asked." "What did he say, Amanda?" David repeated, his voice getting firmer. She looked up at him, fear and stubbornness reflected in her eyes. "He said that I was making a mistake, that I deserved better," she whispered. David grinned, but it was a bitter, evil grin. "Better?" he interjected. "Does he really think he's better than me?" Amanda looked away, unable to find the words. David, clenching his fists, took a step back. He needed to digest what he had heard before he said something he would regret. "Okay," he said finally. "You've made your choice. Now I'll see if you'll be true to that choice." He left the room, leaving Amanda standing alone with the phone, which now felt as heavy as a rock. David sat behind the wheel of his car, parked outside the office building where Amanda worked. His hands were gripping the steering wheel. The words Amanda had said the day before rang in his head. Gregory said, "I deserve better." It wasn't just a blow to his self-esteem, it was an invitation to fight. David couldn't leave it at that. Not only had her boss invaded his marriage, but he had the nerve to humiliate him by hiding behind a phone screen. He decided to confront Gregory face to face. Exhaling to calm himself, David got out of the car. The tall glass building loomed before him as a symbol of the obstacle he had to overcome. His feet carried him to the entrance, and he stood at the reception desk. "I want to see Gregory Wilson," he said, trying to keep his voice firm. The young woman behind the counter looked up in surprise. She quickly looked David over, trying to determine if he was a customer. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked politely. "No," David replied, not wanting to complicate the explanation. "Tell him it's a personal matter. It concerns him and Amanda Brooks." That name was enough. A slight tinge of confusion ran across the woman's face, but she still picked up the phone. After a brief conversation, she nodded. "His office is on the second floor at the end of the hallway. You may go through." David thanked her with a short nod and headed for the elevator. As he went upstairs, he could feel the tension building. 1,000 possible scenarios were running through his mind, but he wouldn't let himself back down. The door to Gregory's office was ajar. Inside revealed a spacious office with panoramic windows and expensive furniture. Gregory was sitting at a massive wooden desk, leaning over a laptop computer. When he heard footsteps, he looked up. A slight smile appeared on his face, as if he had been expecting this visit. "You must be David," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Amanda mentioned you. It's a pleasure to meet you." His voice was calm, but there was a sneer in it. David stepped into the office, closing the door behind him. "I don't need your introduction," he said sharply. "I'm here to settle the matter once and for all. You will leave my wife alone." Gregory raised an eyebrow slightly, as if surprised by the assertion. "Your wife?" he interjected, emphasizing the word your. "David, let's not be under any illusions. If Amanda had wanted to stay with you, we wouldn't be having this conversation now." The words made David clench his fists, but he stepped forward, trying not to lose his temper. "You took advantage of her vulnerability," he said, looking directly into Gregory's eyes. "You manipulated her feelings to draw her into this lie. But it has to end right now." Gregory stood up from the table, his face now serious but calm. He was a few inches taller than David, which added to the confidence of his figure. "Let's get something straight," he said, leaning on the edge of the table. "Amanda is not a child. She's a grown woman who made a choice. Maybe instead of blaming me, you should look in the mirror and ask yourself why she was in my arms in the first place." Those words were the last straw. David stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "Do you think you're better than me?" he asked through clenched teeth. "A man who breaks families and uses another man's wife for his own amusement?" Gregory grinned. Better or worse, it didn't matter. The fact is, Amanda came to me because you disappointed her. Do you want to blame someone for that? Blame yourself. David couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed Gregory by the collar of his shirt and pulled him closer. I'm warning you, he hissed. Stay away from my family. But instead of being frightened, Gregory laughed. Do you really think you're going to scare me? He asked, breaking free of his grip. You're pathetic. That's why Amanda was looking at me, and not you. The word struck like a whip. David didn't think anymore. His fist flew up and smashed into Gregory's jaw with a loud thud. He staggered backward, hitting the table. Are you out of your mind? Gregory shrieked, rubbing his face, where a red mark was beginning to show. This is just the beginning, David replied, his voice low and threatening. If I hear you approaching her again, it's going to end much worse. Gregory raised his hand as if to defend himself, but there was still a sneer in his gaze. Is this your way of defending the marriage? He asked wryly. You've lost, David. She's already left you. Just admit it, he said with a smirk on his broken face. David didn't reply. He took a step back, straightened up, and slowly headed for the door. One last warning, Gregory. He tossed over his shoulder before walking out of the office. Leave her alone, or you'll shake. He closed the door behind him, leaving Gregory alone. But as he descended the stairs, David felt no relief. This battle may have been over, but the war had yet to begin. David returned home, slamming the front door loudly. His heart was still pounding with rage, but it was already beginning to be replaced by burnout. The encounter with Gregory had left a deep mark, but he knew it was only part of what he had to go through. The real conversation had yet to begin. Amanda sat in the living room, curled up on the couch with her phone in her hands. She popped her head up when she heard the sound of the door and saw him. A look of concern slid across her face. You talked to him, didn't you? She asked cautiously, putting the phone aside. David walked slowly to the chair across from her and sat down, staring at her steadfastly. He was silent for a few seconds, gathering his thoughts. Yes, I talked, he answered, his voice sounding strained. And honestly, after this conversation, I have no desire to waste a single second on a bastard like him. My problem isn't with him now. My problem is with you, Amanda. She lowered her eyes, but remained silent. David leaned forward, folding his hands in front of him. I know you had an affair with him. I know you cheated on me with your boss, he continued. I've seen the texts, heard him talk about you. I'm not going to listen to excuses or apologies. It's simple. You have to make a final choice. Now, Amanda looked up. Her eyes reflected fear mixed with stubbornness. David, it's not as simple as you think, she began. This whole thing, I don't know how it happened. Stop it. I'm not a moron. He interrupted sharply, raising his hand. You knew what you were doing. You knew it was wrong. And despite that, you let him get under your skirt. Now you have two choices. Either you cut all ties with him, or I cut all ties with you, and that's the end of it. Amanda shrank back, her voice trembling. I didn't want to cheat on you. But David, for the last few months, I've felt like you've just disappeared. You were there for me, but you weren't. He gave me what I've been missing so much. David stood up. His figure loomed over her, but his voice remained calm, though full of determination. That's no excuse. If you were missing something, you should have talked to me, not sought comfort in the arms of others. You made a choice then, Amanda. Now decide who's more important to you, him or me? She rose from the couch and stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Okay, she said. I'll end the relationship with him. I'll block his number. I'll even quit if that's what you want. But, David, if we're going to continue to be together, you have to make a change too. I can't go back to the way things were. He looked at her carefully, his eyes searching for even a shadow of sincerity in her words. Quit, he said at last. That will be the first step. And no contact with him. Ever. Understood? Amanda nodded, but her eyes were hazy. She picked up her phone and started typing something on the screen. David watched her fingers glide over the keys until she turned the phone around, revealing the screen. On it was a message. This is the end. Don't text me again. She hit the send button and deleted the contact. Are you satisfied now? She asked with challenge in her voice. David didn't answer right away. He turned around and headed for the kitchen, leaving Amanda standing in the room. He needed time to process what had happened. The next day, Amanda sat at her laptop writing her resignation letter. She looked depressed but determined. David watched her from the other room without interfering. When she finished, she stood up and walked over to him. "It's done, darling," she said, holding out the application. He took the paper, ran his eyes over it, and nodded. "Good," he said quietly. "This is just the beginning, Amanda. We both have a lot of things to fix. But this is your first step." Her eyes filled with tears, but she quickly turned away, not letting them spill. She knew that this day would change everything. Their marriage, her life, and how they would exist going forward. The therapist's office was cozy, but a little intimidating at the same time. The soft chairs arranged in a semicircle and the neutral tones of the walls created an atmosphere of safety, but David couldn't shake the feeling that all their secrets would be revealed here. Amanda sat next to him, her hands clasped in her lap, her gaze directed to the floor. She seemed as tense as he was. "David, Amanda," said Dr. Lawrence, a middle-aged woman with a penetrating gaze and a soft voice. "Before we begin, I want to thank you for being here. It already speaks volumes about your willingness to work on the relationship." David nodded, but said nothing. He hadn't come here out of desire, but out of necessity. If their marriage could be saved, this place had to be the beginning. "Amanda," the therapist continued, "tell me why you decided to try therapy?" Amanda looked up but didn't speak right away. Her voice was quiet, as if she was afraid of breaking down. "I want to make things right," she said. "I made a terrible mistake, and I realized that I lost David, the trust he had in me. I know it's unjustifiable, but I want to at least try to get back what we had." Dr. Lawrence nodded slightly and turned to David. "What about you, David? What do you expect from this process?" He was silent for a moment before answering. "Honesty," he said simply. "I want to understand why my wife cheated on me with her boss, and I want to know if we can move on at all. Because, frankly, I'm not sure." Those words hung in the air. Amanda looked away and her eyes filled with tears. The following sessions were not easy. Therapy was forcing them both to step out of their comfort zone. At one meeting, Dr. Lawrence suggested they do an exercise. Talk honestly about their feelings, without blame or defensiveness. "Amanda, let's start with you," the therapist said. "How did you feel the moment your affair began?" Amanda took a deep breath, her voice shaky. "I felt alone," she said. "David was there for me physically, but emotionally, he was far away. I know that sounds like an excuse, but it's not. I was just lost." David listened to her words, holding back his emotions. He wanted to interrupt, to object, but Dr. Lawrence stopped him with a gesture. "Now, David, how do you feel when you hear that?" the therapist asked. "Anger," he answered, his voice firm. "Because instead of talking to me, she found comfort in another person. I was under pressure too, feeling insecure too, but I hadn't betrayed her." Those words made Amanda look away, her face reddening. She wiped her hands on her jeans, as if trying to shake off the growing awkwardness. Between sessions, life continued to go on. Amanda tried to show him that she had really changed. She cooked his favorite meals, offered to spend more time together, even started going for morning runs with him, which had seemed unthinkable before. But David still kept his distance. Her every touch, every word checked his internal lie detector. One evening, as they sat on the couch, Amanda dared to have a frank conversation. "Do you think you'll ever be able to trust me again?" she asked, looking into his eyes. David looked at her. His face remained impenetrable. "I don't know, Amanda," he replied. "I want to, but it's not that easy. Trust doesn't come back overnight." "I'm willing to wait as long as it takes," she said. "Just don't leave me. Please." David was silent. Her words sounded sincere, but part of him still doubted. In one of the last sessions, Dr. Lawrence suggested that they write letters to each other. In them, they had to express their feelings, which were difficult to say out loud. At the next meeting, Amanda was the first to read her letter. "Dear David," she began, her voice trembling, but she continued, "I know that I have hurt you with my actions in ways that cannot simply be forgotten. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to give me a chance to show that I can be better. I love you, and even if you can't forgive me, I'll never stop trying." David sat silent, clutching the piece of paper in his hand. When it was his turn, he took a deep breath. "Amanda," he began, his voice sounding firm, You betrayed me in ways I never thought possible. But despite everything, I want to try. I can't promise that things will be like they were before, but I'm willing to give us a chance." Those words were a turning point for them. It was a small step, but that night, for the first time in months, they fell asleep holding hands. The road to reconciliation was long and difficult. David still had doubts, Amanda still struggled with guilt. But each day they took steps towards each other. Small gestures, quiet conversations, morning walks together, all became the bricks they used to build their new marriage. They had a lot to overcome, but at least they had started. And that's where today's story ends. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and comment. We'd love to discuss this story with you. See you in the next video.